Welcome to the Go Beyond podcast. I'm your host, Charles Scott. On this podcast, I interview exceptional leaders navigating ambition, resilience, and growth. The goal is to help you go beyond your perceived limits. As always, this show is sponsored by the 90% rule, helping leaders escape the grind of the ambitious person's trap and instead spend over 90% of your finite time and energy on things you like, you're good at, and you find meaningful. What's the ambitious person's trap, you ask? That's when you trash your physical health and emotional health in pursuit of your professional goals. The 90% rule is the antidote. Go to executivementorcharlescott.com to learn more. Okay, on today's show, our guest is Tim Hebert, founder and CEO of Dirigo Leadership Consulting, which helps individuals, teams, and organizations unlock their leadership potential through immersive learning experiences. Tim is also the author of the book, The Intentional Leader. So Tim, welcome to the show. Very glad to have you here.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. I appreciate it. Good to catch you up again.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so I'm going to ask you about your work in a minute, but before I do, I always love to start with this question. If you could go back in time and talk with your 18-year-old self, what advice would you give?
So I think at the age of 18, I was going through a lot of transitions. So I had left the state of Maine. I went to the military. I was in basic training. I turned 18 in basic training. And I think at that point in time, there was a lot of uncertainty. I don't think I really trust myself enough. And there was a period of time early on in my career in the military and everything that went beyond that, where I would second guess, doubt, question. We all have that fraud police that jumps in every now and then.
Sure.
And I would say that I tell myself, to learn to trust yourself. You got good instincts, you got good values, you got good decision-making abilities, and that you're not always going to make the right choice, but you'll make it for the right reason, right? So that's kind of where I would start with, because I think there's times when I hesitated when I should have moved forward because I didn't trust myself.
Yeah.
And so I think trust myself is probably the best piece of advice I give myself.
I love what you said too there. You might not make the right choice, but you will make it for the right reason. And this is a distinction I've found helpful, is the difference between the action and the intention. And I find that I can get really agitated when someone assumes from my action bad intent. And I'm
That's
not
right.
trying to harm you for my own gain. And so I'm like, no, give me the benefit of the doubt. So I just know one of my triggers is when people don't give me the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
I'm projecting onto your answer here, but I love that. So you're basically saying your intention matters, and so
Exactly.
even if the execution isn't great, you'll learn from the mistakes. I'm assuming is implied, right?
Exactly. And I think I think I'd add to what you made a comment on is that I think what I learned over time, and I wish I learned it earlier as part of this, is to be really clear what my intentions are up front. So there's no mystery. I've gotten much better at it as I gained more experience and wisdom throughout, doing it not necessarily the right way all the time, and having those setbacks at times, but being really clear, what are my intentions? So there's no doubt about it, right? So
Sure.
so it sets in the right position at that point. So
Good. And by the way, I'm glad that you learned through suffering and your mistakes, because how boring would you be if you just did everything perfectly all the time? Come on. None of us wants that. That's not being human.
exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
No, but what wonderful advice too. And it's so hard when you're 18 years old, you don't have a lot of life experience. Of course, you're going to second guess yourself. I work with, 50-year-old CEOs who are second guessing themselves as well. So that is an inherent attribute I think many people have internalized that doesn't serve them often. I like humility, but there's a point where humility tips over into a kind of almost self-loathing or undermining yourself, and that distinction I think is built in what you said.
She issue with this sometimes is that you go the opposite direction. People become arrogant, they become very ego-driven. And that's not where you want to be either, right? You need to be in that space that allows you to be humble, be able to kind of trust yourself, be willful to make sure you do the right things to get to where you want to go. Then if you have a stumble, you learn from it. You pick yourself up, you dust yourself off, you move forward, and you learn. That's the real key thing. And I've learned a lot that way.
Oh, exactly. So I want to make this a segue because as I listen to you talk, I can imagine you in your professional role working with your clients saying versions of this in the very specific context. So tell me about Dirigo Leadership Consulting. So how did it start and what is your vision?
Yeah. So I will say that my journey as a leader really kind of, I would say, started when I was in my late 20s. I started studying leadership and business and entrepreneurship, and I realized that there was a lot more to being a leader in the company than you're led to believe, right? So I started studying, but it really didn't click until I was, till September 11th happened. When September 11th happened, the next day I had to respond, and I realized the way I had been leading the company up to that point in time wasn't going to work going forward. And so the night of September 11th, I had this kind of epiphany, this change, this transformation occurred, where I realized I needed to step out of being a very good manager and really become an effective leader. And it changed the way I had to communicate with my team, the way I had to use influence, the way I had to do a bunch of things. I needed other tools in my tool bag. So I started a journey to really dig deep into leadership. And part of that journey was teaching my team the stuff I was learning in the same process. So in 2001, we started leadership training in our company. We did once a week, 2 to 4 hours a week. That grew to where not only was my senior leadership team, it became the entire company, became a mandate that entire company, didn't matter what your role was, you went through a leadership training program. We then opened it up to our clients, and we're doing it. So the seeds of it started in 2001. Yeah. In 2023, I had a business that did software development and business consulting. The business consulting, we help people with some leadership issues, but more around strategic planning. I sold in 23 that business, the software side of that business, and I kept the other portion. That became the nucleus of Dirigo. And the thought that we had is that, kind of in a very simple form, is that most organizations, most teams, and most individuals, they hit points where they stall, they plateau. They can't get beyond those plateau levels. And it's not because they're not knowledgeable enough or they're not working hard enough. That's never, ever the fact, or they're not competent. They're usually highly knowledgeable. They're usually highly motivated. They're usually very competent, but they plateau and they can't get over that. And what we realize that there's a threshold that people have to go through, just like my September 11th was my threshold I had to cross. And so that we help navigate across that threshold, going from what we call the knowledge paradigm to what we call the influence paradigm. And leadership is all about how do we influence others to achieve a common goal, right? That's really what leadership is ultimately about. So Dirigo focused on how do we help organizations, teams, and people that stall by helping them understand that their role as a leader is different than being a subject matter expert or being a knowledge expert or relying on 30 years of experience. They have to do things differently moving forward. So that Dirigo is based upon that. We do work with both organizations, teams, as well as individuals that come through. Our work is done through, it's not coaching. We don't really coach, but it's done through immersive training experiences, right? Yeah. So it's very active. You come to our program, and the idea behind the program that we start with is everyone has the potential to be a great leader. It's inside you. You don't need to go searching for it. Our job is to help you see it and change your identity to realize that's who you are versus what you're doing today. And so we refer to that as activation. So how do we people activate what's already inside them to bring that to the forefront?
Love it. All right, and this is a good segue to your book. But before I do that, the discerning listener might have heard that I said Dirigo, and Tim said Dirigo. And in the prep to this podcast, he explained to me that Dirigo is the proper Latin pronunciation. Dirigo is the Maine. So if you're from Maine, the Maine, and he said it's like tomato, tomato. So you're allowed to pronounce it either way, correct?
That's right. Yeah, exactly. And I'm a maniac by birth, so
good. Maniac. Is that what Maine people from Maine are called?
Yeah.
Interesting.
The people that know me well know that I can be a maniac at times. So,
right. And for those who don't have the show notes, Dirigo is spelled D as in David, I-R-I-G-O, which is why I'm pronouncing it that way. So, okay. So, so you said some really interesting substantive things there, and I want to use that as a segue to your book because it's built into what you wrote there. So, the book you wrote, The Intentional Leader, in that you argue that the strongest leadership begins with what you call inner authority, which is knowing yourself, trusting your judgment. So we're going back to your advice to your 18-year-old self right there. Acting from authentic purpose and making conscious choices rather than simply following conventional leadership formulas. So that's kind of like a key part of the book, right? A message of the book. So my question is, how does a leader distinguish between genuinely trusting their inner authority and simply becoming overconfident or insulated from feedback?
That's a great question, Charles. I think that sometimes in leaders, we're so focused on having the right answers, always being right, never being wrong, always knowing where to go. And so that kind of sets us up for a trap, right? We kind of, we live in that world and we're beyond reproach. I would say for me, and the way I look at it is that my awakening occurred when I was in just about 16 years old. I was in English class and we had to read Self-Reliance by Emerson.
Yeah.
And the way we would do it is that instead of like giving a homework assignment, they would read paragraphs at a time in class.
Mm-hmm.
And I was a bad student. I wasn't paying attention. One day they called on me to read a line. And the line was I was supposed to read was, "Trust thyself. Every heart vibrates at an iron string." And I read it aloud. And I don't know, it just sent a chill to my body. And I read it aloud again and again and again and again. And finally, the teacher throws me out of the classroom because I couldn't be disruptive in the classroom. So I was clowning around, but I was so emotionally moved by that. And I think the epiphany I had from that point in time was I didn't trust myself. I didn't know how to go through and do that. And so what I teach people and what we talk about in the book specifically is that you have to do two things to really establish inner authority so that you know you're operating from that place of inner authority. You're not operating from ego and other things that may drive that hubris that exists. The first thing is you have to become very self-aware. You have to develop that self-awareness to look at yourself in an objective way. I refer to that as that you have to be able to create what I call the unguarded moment. Because if you think about it, in our life, we're constantly judging ourselves and those around us. We have this kind of bias that exists of how we look at ourselves, and we have to get below all that. So it's kind of, if you think about what I call the unguarded moment, it's kind of that space of mindfulness, presence, and the ability to kind of look at yourself in all the glory and all the challenges you have.
Right.
And the interesting thing that I found, research on is that most executives in senior level positions will say one of the most important attributes, skills, whatever you want to call it, that a executive leader needs to have, and it's like 95%, is self-awareness. And reality, when they measure it, it's like 10% actually have it, right? So self-awareness is something you have to develop. You just don't have it naturally. You got to work at it constantly. The second is that you have to really understand how you're wired, what your ideology is, and live by that every day, good, bad, and indifferent. So understanding where you want to go in life, what your vision for life is, what your purpose is, what your core values are, and how you manifest those on a day-to-day basis. Your core values help you make decisions. So a while back in this podcast, I made this comment that says, I may not always make the right decision, but I know I made it for the right reasons.
Right.
Well, every decision I make in concert with my core values. And so if I'm constantly doing that, I know I'm making the right decisions for the right reasons. I may not get the outcome I want. I may not execute effectively. I may have misread the market. I may have done a bunch of things, but at least for the right reasons, I made that decision. And so once you're very clear about those things, those values, your vision, your purpose, and what you're doing in life, that's really where this, kind of all comes together for you. And once you establish that, then you can be open to feedback. You can say, listen, I made it for the right reasons. I like to understand, how I can learn from that experience. And you become more open to that. Self-awareness allows you to realize I'm not perfect. I can constantly grow. There's always room to improve. And I want to hear from people that observe me differently than the way I kind of judge and observe myself. And so that's a big part of it. And it takes a lot of practice to do it, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, you've explained it kind of simply or clearly, but you never use the word easy, and there's nothing easy in what you just described, for sure.
Yeah,
but
it sounds easy.
Yeah.
Awareness,
just be self-aware. Just snap your fingers. But what I like about what you're describing is that I'm imagining when you do that, you're also a role model. So when you allow yourself not to be the perfect leader, not demand that of yourself and demand everyone else to treat you that way, you're also showing people who work with you and for you that it's okay to make mistakes. And it's important for you to be clear about your core values. So you're being a role model in that case. I think that's a powerful role of a leader, right?
Exactly. I will tell you, one of my big aha moments around this came, I have really bad dyslexia, so it affects my ability to speak at times. So I have to really be careful how fast I speak, the words I use, right? Because I may have a word up here, but I can't pronounce the word because I don't remember how to spell it and that kind of stuff. So, so that's a challenge. So public speaking has always been a challenge for me. So as I started having to do it more, that inner critic in my head would constantly be going off, and I keep track of every mistake, every mispronounced word, every time I stuttered or stammered. I'd be keeping this log. I get off the stage, and I thought I did a bad job. I was just horrendously bad. People would come up to me and saying, like, that was great. I loved it, and I would criticize myself. And that was part of the process.
Right.
And one day I was on the stage, and I revealed to the audience that I have really bad dyslexia, and getting in front of a group of people like this is really hard for me to do because of that. And I get off the stage, and of course, I'm going through the whole checklist of all the things I did wrong. And I meet this guy. He's almost in tears, and he says, "You don't know how much it meant to me that you said this." And he goes on explaining his whole life and struggle with dyslexia and how he's always been told he's less than. And for me, that aha moment I took away from that simple conversation was, it didn't matter if I mispronounced a word. Can we make people feel something different? And at this point in time, I allowed myself to be vulnerable so this person could felt like that they could connect with me in a way that if I had been strong, I have no problems, I have no issues. We never would have made that connection. And I think that's really the key for leaders is when you show that vulnerability, you're self-aware enough to kind of have those conversations, then you connect with people on a level that's just deeper than you'd ever be able to do if you're not doing that.
Wow. Okay, well, that's powerful. And as a segue into the last question I want to ask you, which is about the ambitious person's trap. So let's see if you might be perfect on this, in which case I want you to brag about it. So, but no, as an entrepreneur and business leader, have you found it difficult to pursue your professional goals and also take good care of yourself physically and emotionally? Because many executives I work with have fallen into the ambitious person's trap where you undermine physical or emotional health in pursuit of your professional goals. So have you been able to avoid this? And if so, how? And by the way, you can be a great role model or an object lesson. Either way would be awesome for people to hear about. So share away.
Yeah, I think that this is an element that people that are highly motivated like me kind of struggle with at times, So in all frankness and honesty, I have never slept much in my life. I probably get 4.5 to 5 hours of sleep a night, just in general. And it's been that way since the age of 2. So it's not like it's something new just to the business world. It's the way I'm wired. I don't need a lot of sleep to move forward. So starting there's an element that's there. And I think in the early part of my career, I was so focused on trying to build a career to get ahead. I came from very humble means. Every day was just waiting for the check to come in to pay what bills you could pay when I was growing up. And the early part of my professional life, it was the same thing. And so you focus, you put your head down, you just do what you got to do to get the job done. But probably at the age of 30, I realized that I was working harder and I enjoyed it and loved what I was doing, but I was getting exhausted. I was physically depleted, and I couldn't understand why, because I just had done it 2 years before, the same rate, same pace, and what didn't affect me the same way. And so what I started looking at, for me at the time, I was trying to manage my time very effectively. And, and it was micromanaging that time to make sure I got everything done and everything on time and, was moving forward constantly. And then when I realized it's not about managing time, it's about managing my energy.
Yeah.
And then there's a number of books that are out there where I've kind of, co-opted some of their language to this, but we get energy from a lot of different sources. So for me, I manage my energy on 4 different buckets. One is knowledge. This is probably the bucket I lean towards the most. I love learning, whether it's reading a book, whether it's watching a podcast, listening to a podcast, whether it's having a conversation like this. The second is physical. And so I made time for the physical aspect of this. So I do a lot of extreme sport, endurance sports like you do, hiking specifically, backpacking, trekking, that kind of stuff. Not only is it good for your body, but it also connects you closer to nature when you do those kind of stuff. And I would also say it also puts you on the edge sometimes. I remember sitting, less than a half mile from the summit of Kilimanjaro, getting me violently so sick, and you're on that threshold of failure. There's nothing more humbling than that, right? So that physical portion is a big part of it. So the knowledge, the mental side, the physical side, the other two sides are spiritual. Can you connect to something bigger than yourself? And I've always been pretty good at doing that. My entire body of work is about helping others achieve what they want before I really focus on myself. So there's an element of that. There's an element of paying it forward in my life that really is a big part. It's been that way forever. The part that suffers the most out of them is the emotional. So sometimes what suffers as I'm going through this is I don't put the same amount of energy in the emotional state, as well as the other side of that is the connections you have with others, the emotional connections you have with others.
Right.
So I have to be really conscious. That's my trap. That's where I fall into the trap in the specific area. It always comes last, and it's always one of the things. Sometimes it slaps you in the face and says, "You idiot! You got to pay more attention to your wife or your kids or whatever the situation happens to be."
Sure. No, and I actually have another. In this podcast, I talk about the ambitious person's trap. But what you just described, I label the caretaker's trap, and that's when you meet other people's needs at your expense.
Yeah.
And so the key is meet your needs and meet other people's needs. It's lovely to care about others and try to be of service, but with a boundary. So awesome. Okay, good. Well, I could talk with you for hours too, but so in the interest of time, I try to make these bite-sized. So we'll wrap it here. What is the best way for people to learn about you or about Dirigo Leadership Consulting?
Yeah, so I think the two best ways to connect with me is through our website. We have a website, Dirigo, DIRIGO.com. If you want to send me an email, info@dirigo.com is probably the easiest way. So we're in the process of redoing our website, so don't judge us too harshly by the look of it. So hopefully by the time this airs, our website will be up and running, a new one. But that's probably the best way. The second best way is probably through LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm an avid, I post constantly out there. I'm on LinkedIn a lot throughout the day, communicating with, former colleagues and, clients and stuff like that through that platform. That would be the other way.
Perfect. And I mentioned it before, but I'll also plug your book, The Intentional Leader by Tim Hebert, Hebert is the book also. So awesome. All right. Well, thank you. Thanks so much for being on the show. I really appreciate it. So as a reminder to everyone listening, this show is sponsored by the 90% rule, helping leaders escape the grind of the ambitious person's trap and instead spend over 90% of your finite time and energy on things you're good at, you like, and you find meaningful. To learn more, go to executivementor.charlescott.com. And until next episode, go beyond your perceived limits and live the 90% life.